All right, folks, so we are jumping into Exodus chapter 3 today. I am realizing as I hit recorded, last week was a little bit bonkers and I never ended up uploading the previous thing. So with that in mind, let's do a little bit of reflection so we can catch Mary Ellen up, who wasn't able to be with us. What are some of the things we talked about last week in chapter 2?
Was that the chapter size was the same as the movie?
Somewhat. That
Okay.
was part of the discussion, is how much overlap and how much did the movies embellish on chapter
Yeah.
2?
Yes.
Oh, yes, yes. Yes.
There was the baby,
Mm-hmm.
and when the baby was 2, no, they kept him at home for three months. And then when they could no longer hide him, they made a basket of bulrushes and put him in the water. And the daughter followed along the river until the princess, was it? The Pharaoh's daughter found the baby in the basket, and the baby cried, and the baby was so beautiful. She took him out and was going to keep it for her own. So the daughter came and
suggested
asked, yes.
midwife, which happened to be the mother.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And so the mother ended up taking the baby home and raising the baby and giving the baby back. I believe it was when it was 2.
Give or take, yeah. We're assuming he's weaned, but still little.
Yeah.
After he was weaned.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The other big discussion was, so that was like Moses's origin story. How was he the boy that lived? And then the second part is, how did he end up not in Egypt? Which we have the story of him seeing the Egyptian beating the Hebrew person, and then Moses being angry enough to then strike the Egyptian, which ended up killing him. There's a whole kerfluffle, it's found out. And he ends up running away in the land of Midian. And we talked a bit about how that story is almost an echo of the stories that we had in Genesis. That all of a sudden he's at the well, like many of his ancestors before, and he helps out some ladies. And just like that, he gets a father-in-law.
And the baby.
And yeah, oh yeah, and he has his own kid. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the baby's coming very fast in the wilderness. There's anything else to do, I think.
Yeah. All right, so that brings us up to chapter 3. I wanted to make sure we all knew why Moses was keeping flocks out in Midian. How did we get from baby boy to shepherd in Midian? So just a few thoughts, and then I'll hear from you all what you think of the intro of this next section. Of, once again, we kind of see Moses has kind of fallen backwards into kind of at or being in a similar place as we see some of the other characters in Genesis. He meets someone at a well, he marries them, and all of a sudden he's keeping flocks, which, if you remember, Egyptians raise cattle, they don't raise flocks, and all of a sudden he leaves Egypt and he is a shepherd keeping his father-in-law's sheep. So there should be one character in particular that sounds familiar from. Jacob, exactly. Except luckily, Moses has a much better father-in-law. The one note I will say is the father-in-law's name changes a few times. In the previous chapter, it was given to us as Ruel, which means the friend of God. In this chapter, it's given as Jethro, which is, I think, the more common name for his father-in-law is Jethro. So it may be that the other guy or the other name is a descriptor where this is his actual name, Jethro. So just in case you were confused. Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, I'm wondering now that we're talking about him keeping the flocks of sheep, and the Hebrews were the sheep herders. that this indicates that he married a Hebrew woman. Just
Yes-ish.
ish.
Ish.
Mhm.
So the people of Midian are in one of the lineages that we have read before, you know, the parts where we're like, oh, we don't like reading this, and we kind of skim over and pick out the interesting ones. The land of Midian is included in one of those, so they are distant relations. By calling Jethro the friend of God, it does imply that he is worshiping the same God as the Hebrew people. There will be a specific moment, which is, I'm not going to give it away because I believe it's in chapter 4, and it's a really weird scene, and we're going to talk about it then. But needless to say, they are not necessarily descendants from like the 12 sons. But
Okay.
this is in the larger family group of the like Canaanite people, more give or take, if
It's
that
just
makes sense.
that's a distinction all along now of who took care of the flocks of sheep and who took care of the cattle, and then just this distinct difference between the two groups. And so here he's marrying a daughter and keeping her father's flocks. It just made me wonder if then that was a Hebrew situation. I don't know why it matters, but yes.
It is, I mean, it's been a motif again and again that it's like, oh, we don't want you to marry someone here. Go to my father's family and marry someone within the clan.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this is, I think, loosely Moses is doing that. Moses is not marrying an Egyptian. He is marrying someone of that general cultural region. Yes.
Yeah, it's another indication of identification. In other
Mhm.
words, whoever is writing this Bible is using that to make sure the people know who's who.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yes.
So that, they all know the Jewish men, it's obvious why they're different. And now here you've got just something, well, this group has a certain occupation, and that identifies that.
Mhm. Right. And what's interesting is we see, if you remember in Joseph, the whole Joseph arc, Joseph slowly lost the like Hebrew identifiers, like how many wardrobe changes he went through. This
Mhm.
is somewhat acting as one of those wardrobe changes. He
Mhm.
came to the well and they're like automatically like, there's this Egyptian dude here because he looked like an Egyptian. And all of a sudden, he is not looking like an Egyptian. He is looking like a sheep herder, which means he looks like a Hebrew.
Mhm.
So there is a bit of an identity shift, certainly. And that will be very important coming up. So good catch. So the transition, though, to the action of the story, it's like all of a sudden Moses is just keeping sheep for his father-in-law, and then we get a few interesting details of he was leading the flock beyond the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God, and there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked at the bush, it was blazing, and yet it was not consumed. This is one of the like famous images of the Bible, and I'm curious what's coming to mind in this description for you all.
Well, I remember what it looked like in the movie.
What it looked like in the movies, yeah. Mhm.
So I was thinking about this what is it called? The scarf you had on yesterday for Pentecost.
Oh, my stole?
Your stole, yeah. Fire. Trying to
Well,
think.
it's so unusual, and I can understand his curiosity that he wants to explore this. How come this is burning, but it doesn't consume the bush?
Bush, yeah.
But he was stopped very suddenly.
Mhm. Yeah, so one other detail that's oddly important for the world that the people were living in. I think you all are used to it at this point, but once again, drawing out some of these details that we've already kind of learned in Genesis that are coming into play now. The angel of the Lord appeared to him, which, remembering that angel means, or the word for angel also means messenger, the messenger of the Lord appeared to him. But then God is speaking directly to Moses, which likely means this is working almost as like an avatar or like a conduit for God to communicate to humans. If you see in the next few verses, Moses is like terrified when all of a sudden the bush says his name and he's like, here I am. And he like realizes there's a deity talking to him. And he says he hid his face. He was afraid to look. There was an ancient notion that if you looked at the face of God, you would die. But the thing that by saying that this is the angel of the Lord, it means that God is using basically a proxy. So Moses is in no fear of death. This is not God actually being there and like him able to look, like he's actually able to look at the bush. He just doesn't think he can, which is just an interesting dynamic I wanted to pull out. So when the angel of the Lord is there, it's kind of saying there is a proxy. So Moses is not going to die if Moses looks at the burning bush. Just kind of a funny detail. So what do you all think of this initial encounter? Moses is kind of just sees this weird thing and kind of just wanders up, and God's like, oh, I have your attention. Let's talk. What do you all think?
Well, let's talk, but take off your shoes first, because this is a holy place.
Holy place, yeah.
Yeah. Just this little detail. And I'm just coming into my mind, touring a museum in France and the Chagall painting of Moses and the
Burning bush.
Yeah, in the way he painted things, a little different looking. But my Bible also mentions at the bottom that the vision of God veiled in fire aroused dread. For divine holiness was experienced as a mysterious power that threatened man's existence. Like you said, can't look at it, but since it's manifested this way, you can. I just think this whole story it's always fascinated me.
Yeah.
The other thing that I noticed is when it says, when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, sort of, suggesting that God is sitting there watching Moses, trumble along the path. And all of a sudden Moses gets off the path to go look at this burning bush. And when God sees it, then he sends his angel, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good thing to note of like, this very much, once again, enters into like, God is in a location.
Yes.
Like God is like, it's not just God being omnipotent and talking through the bush. It's almost like God is in that moment.
That play. He must be right there watching it.
He tells him to take off his shoes. I mean, definitely the image of God being in that space, look at me and also take off your shoes. This is a holy place. It definitely gives the feeling that God is right there.
Well, it must have been a custom at that time to take your shoes off at any holy place.
Yeah, so our understanding of shoes is very different in the modern age, or at least in like industrialized nations, where I feel like most of our conceptions is like, ew, keep your shoes on feet or gross. Where most people like the thought, because we often keep our shoes on for long periods of time, we have socks, we have like lots of padding, so the association, at least I see a lot of people, is like, ew, keep your shoes on, I don't want to smell your feet, because our feet are the thing that are considered gross. So why is it that you would take your shoes off?
Dirty.
Okay, shoes are dirty. Yeah, Larry.
Dust It's a sign of respect to remove your shoes before you go into someone's house,
Hmm.
isn't it?
Depends on culture.
Of the culture.
Yeah,
Depends on who,
Nobody takes.
how white the carpet is.
Say that again, Joe.
I said, it depends on whose house and how white your carpet is.
Mm, mhm. Yeah. Oh,
But-
Mary Ellen or Larry, then Mary Ellen. Larry, you've been trying to jump in.
it just seems to me the people currently in modern times that regularly take their shoes off when they come into someone's house are largely Europeans. That seems to me, at least, to be much more common in Europe than it is here.
Hmm. I think it's Europe and like East Asian cultures often.
Yeah,
do it.
East Asian.
Yeah. Mary Ellen?
Well, I was just gonna, my part that I was gonna put in is that my guests who were here from England last weekend, it surprises me the minute they came through the apartment door, shoes off.
Yeah.
And, I told them they, you don't have to do that, but it was an automatic thing that all three of them did, even the child, immediately shoes off. And I kind of watched, then became aware of my own behavior, and what I do is shoes. Totally different reason for doing it, but yeah, it's a cultural thing, definitely.
Hmm. Yeah. And
The taking of the shoes off and walking on the raw earth, to me makes it much more intimate and connected. So that's the way I looked at it. It's like, this moment is of importance, and I want your full attention. I don't want you insulated.
Mhm.
I'm not getting the right words there, but I just feel that there's something personal about it.
yeah. So
Mhm.
that's another angle to think about. Like if the ground itself is holy, then there should be no barrier. God is saying no barriers between you and me. Which, yeah, that's incredibly intimate if you're basically saying, I want you to touch this holy spot with your very skin. I don't want there to be division or like a veil between us. I have come to you and I'm talking to you, so I want you to be as vulnerable as I am.
Yeah.
But there's also the sense of like, don't bring the dust and the dirt from the world. Also, he's been walking around a bunch of sheep.
Yeah.
You don't bring the sheep stuff into this holy space, which is often when I know people who don't like people wearing shoes in their house. It's like, ew, you may have walked on gum in the outside world. Leave your shoes out like in the area. I will provide you slippers.
Mhm.
Like, don't bring the dirt from the world into this space. And so there's a little bit of like holiness, make yourself holy, but also this like, I want to be close to you kind of a feeling.
A sign of respect.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So God in this moment calls Moses by name twice. And that's normally a wake-up call in like Hebrew language. You see it again and again in later stories. If it's not just like Moses, it's Moses, Moses, to kind of like, I'm here, like I'm talking to you, bud. And then Moses has the very classic response of, here I am.
Mhm.
And that's when we get a lot of God talks a lot in this chapter.
Mhm.
But we hear God say, come no closer. So like shoes off, holy ground, but also like don't get too close to this burning bush here. You're standing on holy ground. But then God identifies as, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Excuse me. So those are the identifiers. Your father, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Is that a good enough identifier for you all to know which God this is? Notably, this is not identified as the God of Joseph, or any of the other 12 sons. It's always just Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the three main patriarchs.
Noticing that. Well, God wasn't always showing up with Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
And God says, I am who I am.
Mm-hmm. We'll get to that. So
Yeah.
what I will say is I want to get through the meat of the chapter, and then we can talk about God's name afterwards, or else we're never going to get to the end of the chapter. So let's keep moving on. Then God has after introductions have been made, God already knows Moses' name. Here we have the identifier, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Lord says, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cries on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their suffering, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up to a land that is good, a broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to a country. And then we have the native inhabitants of the people of that land already: the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, all the sites. So there we have God's thesis statement. Hello, I am here. This is what I'm about. This is what I'm about to do. This is what I want to do.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts on kind of God's thesis statement here?
I think he wants his group to travel together, kind of make a special group of these people that will be worshiping him. And he wants to get them out of Egypt and get them to a place where he can have them worship him as a group.
Yeah, Larry?
It also indicates that God is going to preordain what is going to happen. You know, he's made the plan, he's the master planner. So that sort of suggests that particular concept of God, you know.
Yeah, interesting observation. We'll come back to that. Mary Ellen.
I was just going to say that he's giving Moses the overview of what's to come before he tells Moses his role in all of this. It's like he gives them the vision before he gives him his part to play in it. And I think if that was reversed, Moses would not have, the same reaction. I think he'd be overwhelmed with being asked to go to Pharaoh and, release these people without knowing what God's master plan was first.
Yeah, God has a good sales pitch here. We're going to start by telling the story. And after we tell the story, we're going to bring you in and say how you personally are involved.
Yes.
Yes. That sense is that Moses needs to be persuaded.
Yeah, which is different than like Abraham. Abraham was like pretty good. God came to him and said, hey, I need you to go. He's like, okay, sounds good. We're going. His son was kind of just like, okay, I'll carry on. And then we know how feisty Jacob was. Jacob was like, hey, God, I'll make a deal with you. Like, you say you give me this promise and like I'll do this thing and we're going to exchange. And so Moses is like, well, there are some similarities to the other story. This is the first one where Moses has been kind of like, hold on a minute here. Am I the right guy for this?
And also, I mean, Moses has just killed an Egyptian in the past, and the story leaked out. And so now he's going to be told to go to the Pharaoh. And I mean, that would be a very risky thing to do, because the Pharaoh could capture him and imprison him, kill him, whatever, for the murder of the Egyptian. And instead of having the story progress. So, from Moses's point of view, this was a very risky undertaking for him.
The interesting thing is, and I didn't realize this till I was reading the notes, Moses doesn't necessarily know who the Pharaoh is.
Huh?
Because in the last chapter, the Pharaoh that Moses knew died.
Wouldn't it be his son?
The thing is, pharaohs often had many sons. And so
Okay.
he may have an idea of like the few people that may have become pharaoh, but we also know royal families have a very big habit of killing each other when the throne is up for grabs. So, yeah, Mary Ellen.
Well, I'm thinking back to the Prince of Egypt, and Moses was raised with the Pharaoh's son, who, or the son who would become Pharaoh. So the movie played it up as that they were raised like brothers.
Right. And this is that is something that is really good for cinema because it gets your heartstrings and it pulls them, especially when their confrontation is like, oh my gosh, these are two people who used to be brothers who are now on opposite sides of the conflict. That's not necessarily the case here. I was looking it up, I think after last time, that if we do assume that the pharaoh that Moses is going to interact with was Ramses II, as many people theorize, that means the old pharaoh that died would have been Seti the first or second, one of the two. I knew it at the time. I looked it up at the time, and he had Seti the second. Thank you. He had like 3 or 4 children with his primary wife, which means I don't actually know which in the order Ramses is, but it's theoretical that Moses may not have actually known who succeeded the throne.
Mhm.
So that's one of those, like, a little bit of a question mark. It adds a little bit of a different emotional dimension. It's one thing to know that, like, the person who was raised as your brother is now on the throne versus, oh, one of my siblings, and I don't know which one is on the throne.
Mhm.
Does that change the situation though?
Not necessarily. It's another question mark that Moses just wouldn't even know the situation he's walking into.
He's probably just concerned because it is the Pharaoh.
Yeah.
Whoever it is.
Mhm.
And that would be scary to have to go to him and give this huge request.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that request. One detail that I don't want to miss, because once again, this is just a really cool language detail. In the part that I just read, God says that he has heard the cry of his people. It's like, I have heard the cry of my people.
My people.
This is mine. And currently it kind of has the implication of Pharaoh thinks they're his. These people are mine.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then it says, I have come down to deliver them. And the implication is, if, like, remember the dome we talked about? It's literally, I have left the upper heavens to deal with this situation. I have come down from the place on high to deal with it, which is why God is in that spot. In the bush, in this holy space, God's presence has literally moved locations to deal with this situation, which means it's serious. So, like I said, we're going to skip a little bit of the divine name and we're going to come back to it just because that's going to take up some more time. Let's talk about the actual request of what God's actual plan is going to be. So he tells Moses, like, yeah, you're gonna go to Pharaoh. Here's what you're gonna, or first he says, you're gonna go to the Hebrew elders. This is what you're gonna tell the Hebrew elders. Then you're gonna go to Pharaoh, and this is what you're gonna tell Pharaoh, and this is going to be the result. So what are some of the key points you see? Let's see, I'm starting in verse 16. So start verse 16 to the end of the end. What are some of the key points you see in God's kind of explanation of what's going to happen?
Oh. Well, he's sort of forecasting the plagues and so forth that he's going to inflict upon Egypt. That,
Yeah.
you know, that just the fact that Moses goes to the Pharaoh and relays this message, he says the Pharaoh isn't going to let you go.
Right.
Unless,
Isn't that an
and we got to convince him, and I'm going to convince him.
isn't that an interesting detail though? Like up front, God's like, I'm going to send you to do this and you are going to fail. Yeah, I'm going to have you speak to Pharaoh and Pharaoh's not going to listen. I'm telling you up front, he's not going to. But don't worry, I will do the convincing. Moses, I'm not relying on you to convince Pharaoh. I am going to do that. And it's not going to work at first. Like, that's a bold admission. Yeah, Mary Ellen.
Well, I'm also looking at verse 18, and it indicates Pharaoh didn't go alone, or I'm sorry, Moses didn't go alone. That the elders of Israel went with him, which I think it's kind of symbolic that they're showing the Pharaoh the unity behind this message from their God, that it's just not me alone, a single man, relaying this message to you, but here's the power of the masses who are coming to the Pharaoh to relay this demand.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen, especially some of the iconic moments of like major change in our country and other countries. Like it has a different weight when all of the people show up too. Like there's sometimes that image of like Moses just standing there as like a dude in a huge throne room, and it's just like him and Pharaoh having a conversation. But no, this is one of those like the people are behind him. All of the elders are there, and he is the voice box, but the people are there with him. Yeah, Clay?
And also they're going to do the 3-day journey and the sacrifices. I kind of missed that the first time I read it. I sort of jumped from, down to the part where God says, I'll compel the king of Egypt. I kind of missed that part about there's a short delay. You and the elders have to go out and do a sacrifice and that kind of thing first, which sounds normal.
So this is something that caught my interest this morning too, Clay. So the initial request is like, it's not for an entire exodus. The plan that God is telling Moses to do is, hey, we just want to take a 3-day vacation. We want to sacrifice to our God. We've been here a long time. We haven't worshiped in a while. So can you just let us out into the desert for 3 days and then we'll come back? Is actually the implication is we want to worship and we will return. That's the initial request. Yeah, Larry?
Well, that's what I was just thinking. Is God telling Moses, don't ask Pharaoh to let my people go. Ask Pharaoh to, give us a 3-day vacation. We've worked hard. We've made a lot of bricks. We deserve 3 days to go off in the desert. And so, is that all that Moses is supposed to say to Pharaoh?
At first, yes.
Okay.
It's interesting. The chips on the table right now are just a 3-day vacation. Actually, I guess technically 6 days. Give us a week off because it would be 3 days out, 3 days back, 1 day to worship.
Oh,
Mary Ellen?
Sorry. I'm wondering whether in this plan, this vacation, there was intent to return. If that would have given them a 3-day start as the mass of the Israelites to escape. That, I'm wondering if I'm just wondering about what the intent was. It really to sacrifice and worship, or was it to start the truck?
So this will be the question, and I want you all to keep thinking about it. The other thing that this is the one that like hit me right now, and I am kind of fascinated by it. what are they going to sacrifice? What becomes the sacrifice? Because there's a certain aspect where everything that God is saying right now comes true, including the sacrifice, which is fascinating. So hold on to that little tidbit. But there is a question of like their intentions all along. I am going to conjecture that, yeah, I think Pharaoh is thinking the same way that you are, Mary Ellen. It's like, if I let my servants, my slaves go, they're never coming back. Why would I let them go worship on a mountain 3 days away, and then it takes another 3 days for me to figure out if anything's happened or if they're running on still? Like, this is a head start. Of course I'm not going to let you do that.
Mhm.
And so the question is, was this a genuine request? Was it a smaller request? This is also often, this has also been used occasionally in like in movements that are trying to change things. Of you ask for something little that seems, of course, like a week vacation, that sounds like reasonable for like slave labor, of course. And by denying that request, you actually get the people that you're trying to work with you to get mad enough to do something, because look, your oppressors are denying you something that is so insignificant that it's also maybe a way to get the other people also on their side by having that request denied. So, but the question, but keep it in mind, because Moses will go, and just pay attention to his language as he is actually asking Pharaoh for things. What is he asking for? At what point in time? And what is Pharaoh saying no to? But it does seem like that the God's intent is not just for that week-long vacation. It seems like the intent is to get the people out of Egypt, but it's not going to be a straightforward path. There's going to be some bumps in the road. Notably, in verse 20, God says that Pharaoh's going to say, no, I'm going to reach out and I'm going to strike Egypt, which is the same verb, once again, is what Moses did to the Egyptian and the Egyptian did to the Hebrew. So in a way, there's almost a similarity of like, yeah, I know, Moses, like you struck an Egyptian, but I'm about to strike Egypt. So you start to see some of the parallelism. But
Well,
the end, oh yeah.
Well, I'm captivated by the words "strike Egypt with all my wonders," because the plagues are coming, and to call those his wonders, I find fascinating, and I don't have a supposition about it, but it sounds very strong, as very positive, my wonders, but then the plagues were very negative. So anyway.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
flashy, frogs dropping from heaven is a pretty flashy thing. So,
but is wonder something normally you strike with?
wonders.
So I don't know about you. My mind autofilled might. I will strike Egypt with all of my might, and I had to pause when it said wonder.
It's unusual in that respect. It might be a wonder, but I think of wonder as something positive and really nice. And these are not nice.
Yeah, but being able to cause them,
Yeah,
does
that's a wonder.
that is a wonder.
Yeah.
Are we up to the part where the women have to ask the Egyptian women for gold and silver? I thought that was pretty good. He's going to make it so that they don't have anything left there in Egypt.
So yes, so that was the last part I was going to bring up before we talk about God's name. You shall plunder the Egyptians, which the word also means to like strip. So you're going to strip the Egyptians around you from their wealth, which is kind of an echo of what Jacob did to Laban when Jacob left. Laban's like, you took everything from me. And once again, this is kind of in that similar, you're going to leave, but you're going to be rich because of it.
Well, and
But-
what Joseph did,
Huh?
what Joseph did to the Egyptians by
Mhm.
making them into slaves.
Right. So we see this kind of thing that
Nasty stuff.
they're going to
Wow.
end up coming out ahead.
But why would the Egyptian women give up their silver and gold? Are they in favor of this thing that the women are doing? I mean,
You will have to wait and see. I could give you an answer, but it'll spoil the story. So,
Well, he implies it in 21, he says, I will bring this people into such favor with the Egyptians that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. It sounds
Oh,
like
okay.
they're willingly giving up everything to them.
mhm.
oh, that's
Yeah,
a
Mary
kind of
Ellen?
neat thing to do.
Well, when it's time to go, they've been through all the plagues, and I'm sure the Egyptians would be very glad to see them go.
Mm.
And would give them whatever they asked in order to get them to go. But I'm also, in the back of my mind, and I don't want to redirect the discussion, but God is also providing, all this gold, whatever, to give them the wherewithal to create the golden calf later on in the story. And I had always wondered where the riches came from at that point to enable them to do that.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So
Hmm.
that's just an observation, predict, whatever, but
Yeah.
Well, Yeah, but it's strange. It sounds like they're going to ask the Egyptians to voluntarily give them jewelry of silver and gold and clothing. And then it says they're going to plunder them. So is it
Well,
is it the same thing? Is it a parallel statement or?
Yeah, that's the redundancy of Hebrew writing.
Yeah.
So the
Okay.
plunder is also means strip. So to like take everything off of.
Okay, so but it's supposed to be voluntary.
Well, when we get to that part of the story, we'll talk about it then. So remember it.
mhm.
The one last detail to add in about this. This in some way could be seen as payment for unpaid labor. They have been working for generations as slaves and never getting paid for their work. This is their payment. Yeah,
Okay.
Mary Ellen,
what are they going to use it for?
you will see. Hold on to that question. It comes around, I promise. Yeah, Clay?
My Bible is Revised Standard Version, and it uses the word despoil.
Despoil. Interesting.
Rather
Okay.
than plunder,
All right.
which to me is a little not as harsh.
Yeah,
Okay. Wait, Mary Ellen, did I cut you off? Did you have another thought?
Thing. Just
Well,
spoil it.
I added that, my thought was, what are they going to use it for? Because they're heading out into the desert, but you said that's coming, so okay.
Okay. All right, with that in mind, let's talk. We have about 12 minutes left. Let's talk about the name of God. If you all have more questions, we can start next time off with it. I just wanted, I know that this is a meaty topic and we've kind of been through it a little bit before, but I actually have a slideshow for you all to actually give you visuals for what I've said a few times.
okay, good.
So, where we get God's name is because Moses, understandably asked, if I'm going to go to a people and talk to them, they're going to ask me who you are. Who are you? And the first comment God makes is, I am who I am, which is the very classic way of translating this. Some scholars argue that the verb tenses that are used should be, I will be who I will be. Other ones are, I will be gracious to who I will be gracious to. I will be whatever I will be. So there's this kind of very big question mark of God's just like, I'm almost nameless. I'm gonna be what I need to be in any moment, and you're not gonna tie me down to one thing. And I'm curious about your all's thoughts. Oh yeah, Clay?
Well, I've got this, how to read the Bible. And here it says that answer kind of equates to none of your business, which I found very interesting. It's kind of like, don't bother to question.
Yeah.
Yeah. What kind of answer is that?
Yeah,
Like,
it's a non-answer is what it is. Yeah.
Well, that's true. Yeah, we're not supposed to
Yeah.
God isn't made in our image, we're made in God's image.
yeah.
I just found that interesting.
Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Can also be that the response is, I cannot be defined. I cannot be limited by words. I am who I am, and it opens up the endless possibilities of whoever I need to be at the time I will be. So
And
yeah.
in chapter, I think it's 14, said in my Bible, it says, I am who I am is an etymology of the Israelite name for God, Yahweh.
So let's actually go to that, and we can talk about the name of God as we understand it. So God says, I am who I am. I'm gonna be who I'm gonna be. I'm kind of nameless. I'm gonna be what people need me to be. I am beyond your comprehension. That kind of none of your business. I am too big for you to understand. That said, then God does go on, thus you shall say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me. This is my name forever, my title for all generations. So God basically says, I am who I am, and then kind of gives this name. Note that what that is, when it says the Lord, that is the holy name for God. Helen, you tagged it as Yahweh. The key thing to know is this is not God's proper name necessarily. We kind of treat it like God's proper name, but what you see is this will be my title. This, God gives God's self basically a way to be referred to in easy language. Basically, I have no name, but if you need a name, here's a name. But it's considered more of like a title, a kind of working thing, so you can talk about me easier. But that said, we don't actually know what this word's supposed to be. So here's your $10 word of the day is the tetragrammaton. is how you refer to this word. Is what it's referring to. Oh, there we go. Oh, all right. So God's name, God's title, it's represented by 4 letters. This is the very ancient version of Hebrew. This is, my PowerPoint's messing up on me. This is the middle version, and this is Hebrew as we know it today. And all these letters are connected, and you can kind of see how they evolved. That's a whole other lesson of like how you get from this to this. But this is modern day Hebrew. Notably, first off, you can see, I've said before, there's no breaks between words. This is the Aleppo Codex. This is what is considered the authoritative version of of what we call the Old Testament. There is not really many breaks. You can see how things run together. And you see all these little dots and dashes above and below words. That is how Hebrew denotes vowel pronunciation. Originally, when Hebrew was written, all they had was the consonants. They didn't include vowels. You were just supposed to know what they are. And eventually they're like, you know what? We should probably distinguish what vowels are in what places. And so the Masoretes, This is the system of how they added vowels to manuscripts. So they basically put dots and dashes above and below words to denote which words were pronounced which ways. So these are all vowel markings. This is something we've been over before. This shows you a little bit better how we get from one writing to another. So the Tetragrammaton does not have the correct vowels. We know this for a fact. This is the word Adonai. So other key thing to know, Hebrew reads right to left. So this is a silent letter. It's kind of weird, but this is the A. There's a D with an O, Ado. This is an N with this symbol, and this kind of functions as a Y. It's a weird vowel letter thing. So that's how we get Adonai. The thing is, if you put this on the Tetragrammaton, you see how the vowel markings are the same on different consonants. This is how you end up pronouncing this word as Jehovah. Oddly enough, this sound can make a Y or a J sound. So Jehovah. Jehovah is a non-word. It is mispronouncing the Tetragrammaton. Because why they did this is this was a signal that you should pronounce, you're not supposed to say God's name, basically. And so the vowels are for the wrong word to indicate that you're supposed to pronounce this as Adonai, which is the Lord, which is how we translate it in the Bible often. So every time you see capital L, lowercase, uppercase L, like small uppercase R, small uppercase D, that means this is what's appearing, is the Adonai on the Tetragrammaton. The interesting thing is occasionally we do get another form of it. This is Elohim. Once again, silent letter. This indicates an E sound. This is an L-O-H-I. That's a vowel symbol for the I-M. So that's Elohim. And then you see these vowels get put onto the Tetragrammaton, which creates a different word. I actually don't fully know how to pronounce this one. So we see both versions occasionally. When we see this, we will pronounce it as Adonai. When we see this one, you'll pronounce it as Elohim, which is just like God. So these are what we have written in our official codexes. We don't actually know what the original vowels were, because this practice of saying the Lord or God instead of God's name is a practice that goes before the vowel markings. So the vowel they never vowel marked what the Tetragrammaton was supposed to be said. So some people have guessed. So these are a bunch of guesses that we don't know which one's right. So we see it with no vowels. This one is pronounced Yewa. This one is more Yehewa, Yehovah. All of these are guesstimations. Most people land on this one, which is Y-A-H-E-W-A-H. I remember my Hebrew. So that's how we get Yahweh is from this. And why they think this is the best guess is because it sounds like wind. And I know this is a weird reason to choose this, but if you go Yahweh, it puts a lot of breath out there, and God spoke the world into being. The wind and the breath of God are important. Literally, wind, breath, and spirit are all the same word. We just know they're different by how it's used differently. So wind and breath and spirit are all connected to things that God does in creation. Literally, God breathes life into us, which is in a way like God literally breathes spirit into us. And since God is mostly spirit, God is often depicted as wind. We think that this word may be very breathy to kind of imply that like breath of God's spiritness, which is how we end up with Yahweh, but we don't actually know. This is a scholarly question. We don't there's no way to tell if this is accurate or not. Basically because they never recorded the vowels that were supposed to be there. So, but notably, that is God's title. Whatever the original meaning is, it is still more considered God's title, which is just an easy way to talk about God. But then there was the cultural thing of like, don't say God's name. And so we lost actually the understanding of how to say God's title.
Okay.
So, any thoughts on
Did you-
God's title
we
there?
don't say God's name. Is that true now? I mean, what?
So, how this came about, and yes, most Christians kind of obey this anyways, is what happened, or one of the things that grew out of rabbinical work pre-Jesus even, is that you build a fence around the Torah. I've talked about this before, of like, if you don't want to break a rule, then you draw a bigger circle around that rule so you don't even get close to it. So one way you never take God's name in vain, well, you can't take it in vain if you never say it. So it's a protective measure that they did, that we don't want to take God's name in vain, so we're just never going to say it. And then the understanding of how to say it has been lost to history. And so because it has been the cultural practice for so long not to pronounce God's name, we have lost the ability to know if we're pronouncing God's name.
So God is not the name.
No.
I get it. So Jesus, when he was dying, said Father,
Yes.
and that's not his name either.
The Aramaic, and I don't know how accurate my pronunciation is.
I don't know.
Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is my God, why have you forsaken me? People thought he was crying out for Elijah, though. But it's Eloi or Eloi, one of those two things. But that's Aramaic, that's not Hebrew. So mind you, this is the other thing to keep in mind. Enough time passed between when this scripture was written in Jesus's time that Jesus would have had to have learned a different language to read the scriptures. It would be like us today trying to read Old English. It's not the same. And so even by the time they're rebuilding the Second Temple, they have to have a translator when they read from the Hebrew scriptures because they're speaking Aramaic. So they're actually the better comparison is like French to Latin or like Italian to Latin, where it's a little bit stronger connected, but they're not the same language. And so like even by Jesus's time, they really didn't say God's proper name, and we don't know what it is. So
they need to go to Hebrew school, right?
Yeah. That's why we know Jesus was at least partially educated, is because he could read Hebrew scripture, which meant he actually knew both Aramaic and Hebrew. So
I didn't know that. I never thought about it that way.
Okay.
So when we say Yahweh, we just think it's God's name.
Yeah, and it may be. It may not be. We honestly don't know.
A friend of mine who's Jewish said she grew up with the word El, just El for El. She didn't know, she never heard Yahweh. She just said it was El.
So El and Elohim is the plural version of El.
Okay.
So when we use the term Elohim, we are using like the royal we for God, basically. So El is the word for God, just in the same way it is a direct translation. When we talk about God, the Hebrew translation would be El, but that would be the same for any god or goddess. If you call Zeus a god, you would say El in Hebrew. So that's like the generic term for a god is El.
El, okay. So But we're not supposed to say God's name.
Saying God is not God's name or title, it's a description.
Oh, no, that's what I mean. So
Yeah.
Yahweh is not something we're supposed to say. We're not supposed to say that.
Well, it's really hard to say a word you don't know how to say. So we have been protected from it.
Yes. Oh, that's interesting.
So we do, this is one of, I know we're over time, but just a quick mention about the source theory and kind of where we've been before, and kind of bringing in some other ideas to why this name becomes important. So remember, we've talked a lot about like the kingdom of Israel splits into two kingdoms, the upper or the northern and the southern kingdom, the southern one being the one that has Jerusalem and the temple. When it comes to the different traditions in Genesis, the story before, the ones that use the Lord are the ones that are using the tetragrammaton. They're the ones that hold most closely to using the name of God, which makes sense because that is the temple where God is supposed to reside. Like literally, God is supposed to be in that temple. And so they use God's name in their writings. As we go forward in Exodus, this is why Exodus is a little bit harder to tell which tradition is writing. We can still see they're stitched together, but it's a little bit harder because now both traditions are using God's proper title. So both the Lord will be a lot more commonly used because God's divine name has been officially revealed, or God's divine title. If you can see, it has this very strange status of like God is both nameless and here is a title. Don't use the title too much. So any thoughts as we wrap up for today?
Fascinating. I mean, this whole educational part of it has just been fascinating. Thank you. All that research, all that knowledge that you have, I'm very impressed.
Oh, believe it or not, this is actually one of the things that professors will beat into seminarians' heads because there's a lot of different theories. That this is like Old Testament 101. They're like, we don't know God's name. This is actually like has given so many scholars a headache. But like, this is how we get Adonai. This is how we get Yahweh. This is how you get Jehovah. Which I think when I've been in hospitals and I've heard people literally pray to Jehovah, and I'm like trying not to laugh because like I know how you end up with Jehovah, but it's one of those just like, if that makes you happy, then use it. And but it's also one of those things of like, if you like using the term Yahweh as kind of a special way to reference the God specifically of Scripture, I don't personally have a problem with it. Some people think it's disrespectful because we don't actually know. But if it's one of those that if it's the verbal equivalent of taking off your shoes, I would say go for it.
Okay. I like Yahweh very much.
Okay. I mean, it is kind of, there is a niceness to have a way to reference God other than like a generic term for like any God, which is I think why people really want to know what the title is. And literally it says like, this will be my title for all generations. And it's almost sad that we've lost like certainty on like how we're supposed to say God's name. And instead we have these 4 characters that we're like wondering about.
But I love the idea from that book is none of your business.
Yeah.
I have to read that chapter.
I can't help when people think they're swearing, you know, Jesus Christ, oh my God, you know, people aren't swearing because we don't know his name.
Yeah. That's an interesting way to think about it. Yeah, you can't, once again, you can't take something in vain if we don't know how to say it. So all right. Well, with that, let us wrap up for today. I know we ran a bit long. All right. So we'll do chapter 4 next week, but let's pray us out for today.
Mhm.
Good and gracious God, you are a God that, yes, has been remembered for the generations. Even if we don't know how to say the name that you gave us to reference you, we know that you still listen to us when we cry out, whether it's crying out in joy and celebration, whether it's crying out in anguish and sorrow. We trust that you still hear us today, and that you respond, much like you did here, of coming down to deal with the situation. We trust that you are not tucked away apart from us in the heavens, but that as the very wind blows today, we can feel your spirit blowing through our hearts. Give us courage when you ask us to step up for things as grand, that feel as grand as like Moses going to Pharaoh, and help us be comforted like you comforted Moses when he didn't feel like he was enough. Give us hope that things can change, especially when we work with you for your vision of how things are going to come about. And just thank you for always being present to us throughout history. So we pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much. So fast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. See you
All
all
right.
next.
Okay, but Jesus is a name. So a lot of Christians refer to Jesus as God.
That's a whole other discussion, Sue. We can save that one.
I don't, but
We can use spirit.
Uh-huh. All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.